Good evening, everybody. I'm Claire Annesley. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture at the University of New South Wales, and I am so pleased to welcome you here. Thank you so much for coming through the rain for this incredible evening tonight. We're here for the Donald K. Turner Utzon Lecture, which is presented by Mun Summ Wong and Richard Hassell, co-founders and directors of the architecture practice WOHA. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, those the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting tonight. First Nations people have been living, meeting and practicing culture on these lands for thousands of years, and we recognise them as the traditional custodians of the lands. I pay my respects to them as traditional custodians of the lands and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us tonight. I've actually got quite a few people to recognise because so many organisations and individuals have jumped at the opportunity to be involved in this event, which is, I think, a reflection of how keen we all are to hear from Mun Summ and Richard this evening. So firstly, our thanks goes to the family of Donald K. Turner, whose gracious endowment allows us to continue to deliver an Utzon lecture in his name each year. I'd also like to thank the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat and their two sponsors, Oxford Properties and CPB Contractors, for their support of this event this evening. And lastly, I would like to thank Penelope Seidler, whose generous gift has allowed us to appoint Mun Summ and Richard as the Seidler chairs in the practice of architecture at UNSW. As part of this role, they have been at UNSW this summer running an intensive studio with our architecture, landscape and interior architecture students, many of whom are here tonight. There's some gentlemen down the front here. And they've been working in this studio exploring the design of high-density and net-zero carbon-built environments. And this has been an absolutely incredible experience for our students, and we'd like to recognise Penelope's generosity in making this happen. Penelope, thank you so much. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers, Mun Summ and Richard. They are the founders and directors of WOHA, an international award-winning architectural practice based in Singapore. WOHA was established in 1994 and is committed to creative solutions to the big challenges that face us all. How to build sustainably, how to create diverse and delightful environments, how the built environment can create and enhance a sense of community, and how we can achieve density, yet improve amenity. This practice has received multiple awards, including the Icon Award, the World Architecture Festival Building of the Year Award, and the CTBUH Best Tall Building in the World Award. We are absolutely delighted to have Richard and Mun Summ here at UNSW Sydney as our Seidler chairs in the practice of architecture, and as delighted to be able to invite them up onto stage now and introduce them to you. Richard and Mun Summ, the stage is yours.
Thanks everybody for coming out on this very wet monsoon.
Yes, we apologize. We bring the rain with us everywhere we travel.
And I just wanted to repeat the thanks to Penelope Seidler for her patronage of our studio and the chair position, and also for the example that the Seidler practice has set for so many decades in terms of design excellence and designing for the future. Also to thank UNSW, which has been amazing hosts and collaborators on the studio, particularly Claire Annesley and Philip Oldfield as well, who've been amazing and just made the whole thing go so smoothly and so enjoyably for us. So these are 3 books that we've been fascinated by for a while, and I think they're offers some new perspectives, I guess, in what architecture can do. So our topic, Form Follows Systems, is really trying to think how we can use systems thinking and system theory as a way of maybe opening some doors to how we practice in the future. So the first one, the systems view of life, is really interesting in giving a sort of link to systems thinking, but how it connects both to the many ancient philosophies, such as Chinese Taoism, as well as quantum physics. So a really amazing sort of overview of domains of knowledge that seem to all be converging on an understanding of the world. The Web of Meaning by Jeremy Lent is really interesting. Also sort of takes philosophical look at what is the meaning of life in a sort of post-religious, post-mechanistic, rationalistic view of the world. And he draws a conclusion at the end that the meaning is generated through the connections we make and the way we productively work together. And the last one, A Good Ancestor, is a really interesting one, particularly coming to Australia now, where with the giving thanks to the First Nations and the thinking about custodial relationship to country. So it asks the question, are we being good ancestors to our descendants? And I think that long-termism is a really necessary view to counter the short-termism that we all deal with. So I was trying to do a little sketch, trying to think about what we meant by form follows systems. And so this little cartoon was really that currently we design these beautiful, mainly isolated objects that are really well considered and crafted. But if you imagine an animal in the zoo, you know, it's this amazingly evolved creature, but it's kind of separated. And so thinking that can we wake up these buildings and so they become a little more active, and then start thinking how we forge these connections between them, and that these connections would start making system effects where we get all kinds of beautiful and wonderful outcomes that are really not through putting more inputs into the system, but just making the system have a lot more feedback loops and a lot more productivity through its relationships. So we've evolved this idea since around 2000, and so we've just got a little bit of a history of how we ended up where we've ended up. So we did an exhibition in Berlin in 2006 called More on Less, which argued that buildings should be more ambitious in their wider effects. The next one, Singapore 2050, we did in 2009, and that one we led a studio at NUS and then developed our own schemes, thinking how Singapore could be self-sufficient in food, energy, and water. And Singapore, as a tiny little country where the city covers the island, is particularly susceptible to shocks, outside shocks. And so to us, it's a canary in a coal mine about the way every country is actually going in terms of consuming its resources and running out of space. In 2011, we had an exhibition at the Deutsche Architecture Museum, and that was a really good chance to sort of pin up everything we'd ever done and draw some structure and direction out of our practice history. And Germany in particular, being interested in, with their strong green history, were very receptive to our approach. Following that, we have taught a studio at National University of Singapore for 11 years now, and we basically reran that idea, can Singapore be self-sufficient, year after year, developing more data and more nuanced responses, and have recently started including the economics department, as well as many other domains coming in and thinking how to have this systems effect through the stakeholders we engage as well. And some of that research ended up in Garden City Megacity, which we presented in Venice in 2016. So in that book, we posited sort of 5, we thought there were sort of missing measures that could perhaps counteract some of the short-termism and more sort of developer-friendly measures. So in some ways, these were counterbalances to things like facade-to-floor area efficiency or net-to-gross efficiency, and thinking what those efficiencies, which sound very good because they're called efficiencies, but what they were doing to very important aspects of the commons or the performance in nature. And we've just recently published a book with Thames and Hudson, New Forms of Sustainable Architecture, which gathers the last 30 years of our practice together. And so now what we've been, after Garden City Megacity, we've been thinking how to improve or expand or refine the idea. So we're looking now at sort of more measures that come together that maybe give a more total picture. All of these ones we're figuring out how do you move from this to architectural form. I think there are a lot of systems which maybe don't appear as form or affect form, but this is sort of hot off the press, so we're still figuring out through our studios and through our own office development. A rough outline, we think what this might mean is to first declare that 20th century urban planning is perhaps outdated based on an oversimplified and materialist worldview, and the planning often provides only a simple and baseline performance in 2 dimensions. We think 21st century urban design has to find ways to enhance multiple productive systems at once, social, technological, economic, and ecological systems. And we realized through this systems thinking that designing relationships between components is just as important as designing the elements themselves. So a bit of a reframing from sort of object to relationship. An analogy is the difference between studying individual plants and animals versus studying an ecosystem. And the great thing about productive systems is they have these positive feedback loops which makes the whole greater than the sum of the parts. So through systems thinking and systems design, productivity, sustainability, and happiness can be increased by developing these positive feedback loops. And these loops in form are really designed relationships that create these beneficial loops. And I think the really important thing with systems thinking is that you get these beneficial effects without putting in more resources. So it's a quality of the system itself. It's not a quality of spending more on it. And so we thought, what does this mean, systems thinking and design? So one is to make the problem as big as you can. So the initial brief is just a tiny part of what you need to embrace. You analyze current and proposed relationships with international, national, regional, and local systems. So understanding development as a change in existing system flows. And so you look for positive outcomes through improving good relationships and breaking negative ones. And what we always tell our students and everyone, don't assume anyone else has thought of the big picture, because most people work hard to make the problem as small as possible. From a business point of view, it's probably the worst possible strategy. But I think it's really important to break us out of always assuming that the bigger picture is someone else's problem. So what we look for is win-win adjustments by designing relationships which cost nothing except design time. So it's the same stuff, organized differently for higher productivity and better outcomes, and tackle roadblocks which prevent these positive outcomes. So we're extremely irritating, I think, often to our clients and the government authorities in terms of being a bit of a bull at a gate, that we're going, why can't we do it? And we fail most of the time, but occasionally we get a win. And just the concept from Garden City, Megacity, which we still think is very important, is this concept of prototypology. So we try and design every building we do as if it belongs to a regenerative city of the future. Each project is seen as a component within existing systems, affecting them for good. And each project seeks to cause positive ripples that might trigger further positive change. Each project is open to future systems connections. Mun Summ, over to you.
So this is a rethinking of the vertical skyscraper. We weren't so concerned about building a habitat for human beings, but we were more concerned about building a habitat for animals and creatures. We have been always very successful in developing horizontal habitats where flying animals and insects could land, but we were not so successful in finding one that perhaps climbing animals like squirrels to get to the various habitats. So as you can see from this image, it's almost like a tree, and it actually, this is the infrastructure for the climbing animals to actually climb and get to the upper levels of the building. So I think we have been very successful, and that our general manager of the hotel has told us that every morning on the 10th and 10th floor, or is it 11th floor, the public areas of the hotel, they have spotted squirrels. This one is it?
The big green one.
So it's really a thinking of typology here. And I think what's shocking is that the floor area is quite similar to the one in Carlton. But because we have thought about the negative spaces and the volume that we want to create rather than the floor area, it's sort of ballooned up in a big way. But the good things are sort of explained a little later, but the sort of a modification that we made was to transform a block of messing that would be otherwise very compact into 4 stratum, and each stratum sort of have a full 4 plate of sky terrace. And we converted this sky terraces, stratums into breezeway atriums, where you can actually overlook them and then sort of dress it with a green living facade. Oops, what was that? Sorry. Hang on. Okay. So what we managed to do was then to be able to do a replacement of more than 10 times the site area. And this has got huge implications. But before we go into it, this is a simple sort of a layout of all the floor plans. It is just an L-shaped plan with the structure all in the corners, and we've been able to rotate it every time each stratum goes up. And as you can see from the cross-section, they are giant transverse structure to support each new ground level that we created. But what is really interesting is the post-occupation surveys that we have conducted, where we now realizing that our buildings have a very different performance and outlook as compared to other buildings. And you can actually see when we actually conducted an energy consumption audit using thermal sort of imaging thermometers, as compared to a building that's glass, stone, and steel, the surface temperature is halved. And this is actually how we actually can reduce urban heat island effect in the city. And also through the shadowing of through the large sky terraces, we also be able to reduce sort of with large shadows that's created, reduce the energy consumption within the spaces itself. But the other interesting thing that we've been doing with all projects is that we now conduct ecosystem services measures, and these are projected as well as measured. And in this case, as you compare against a pristine low-level rainforest, which is what Singapore used to be, this hotel development perform somewhat between 25 to 30% of this lowland rainforest in doing things like regulating air quality, something that is so essential for the survival of our human species. The air we breathe in, is oxygen. So the building here actually do perform the sort of responsibility of converting carbon dioxide into oxygen. So I think this is something I think we can demand a lot more of our buildings, that it actually performs ecosystem services for us and also for the planet. But what is really quite heartening is that this green facade, being placed next to a neighborhood park, what is interesting is that because it's side by side with it, the animals were able to hop onto it. And what is really nice is that when we did the biodiversity survey of it, it has the same amount of roughly the same amount of animal species as the linear park that is actually on ground level that is close by. So this is something that's very heartening. And we have received quite a lot of sort of feedback that people enjoy seeing this building, seeing how it sort of changes day by day. Sometimes, they're flowering. Sometimes it's actually waving when it's wind sort of blowing against it. So we do get very positive sort of feedback on this particular building.
So the next project we're sharing is a public housing project, Skyville at Dawson. We're really pleased to have done this project because I think often what we show people say, yes, but it looks very expensive, it doesn't look affordable. And so this was done on a really affordable budget in Singapore. At the time, around 1,600 a square metre, which would be probably quite a bit more now.
In fact, we were penalised because we were able to precast every single thing in this building, and that it went 15% below budget, and our fees was based on percentage.
Oh, yes. Yes, so they clawed back fees off us after it went out for tender. So these are the basic strategies, and I think some of that thinking about community and systems and the whole and the parts. So it's very large, 960 houses. If we looked at the massing that using a typical plan, it would create quite a wall of buildings. And really we thought, how do you ever get to know 960 families as a neighbour? You just sort of want to give up at the very thought of it. So the initial strategy we thought was, how do we create community within it? At the same time, we wanted these strategies to perform environmental services as well. So we thought it was interesting to open up the blocks to create these vertical breezeways inside, to slice it up horizontally into sky parks. So we have these social spaces, because I think all human interaction happens on the horizontal. And so the more you can develop horizontal spaces, the more natural social interaction you get. That we could roll out public space throughout the project.
One thing was quite instrumental in the thinking was when we were designing this, it was at a time after 9/11, where we felt it was necessary for us, if we were to do a very large building, a mega structure, was to find multiple ways of actually moving around in a building, not only horizontally, but in a sort of snake and ladder manner within the development.
Mm. Yes, it's depending on the country, it would be a security nightmare, but Singapore is super safe. So the idea of having multiple exits and being able to run away from the police in every direction is not a problem there.
But the outcome is that I could always walk a few floors up or down to visit my friends. And that's what the impact of this development does.
Yeah. And then at the top, the solar canopy, and those things all come together to make. So it's quite, in a way, it's like the form of the building is this strategic diagram of relationships. It also has public park. It's along a linear park, existing linear park. So it has a town plaza, childcare, and things along the ground plane. So it interacts with the neighbourhood in a very welcoming way. And then as you go up, then the total site, we have internal playgrounds and sports fields as well, which are very well used, and preserving the existing trees.
Yeah, one of the justification we had for going high up, high rise and high density, was because there's a sort of a realignment of the road. The road in front of the development was expunged so that it has a larger parcel, but we felt it was necessary for us to keep these mature rain trees. And we felt it needs to take priority over sort of spreading the buildings for the entire site, because we wanted from the building, when it's completed, to have a very mature park for people to enjoy.
And then this idea is a sort of community living room, so the letterboxes are placed here, and it's almost like a garden pavilion or pergola that looks out over the park. In Singapore, there's a particularly unique thing called the void deck, which is no one wants to live on the ground floor, so they're usually open, but just structure, some plumbing, maybe a seat or two. So in these ones, we wanted them to feel much more like a room with furniture. So we designed in this extremely tough precast concrete furniture, but in a way it's like a lounge, a side table with a lamp and a little coffee table stool. The section is also very diagrammatic in a way, but just it breaks the very tall building, 47 floors, into 4 stacks of 11. And so each of those levels forms a village that every apartment belongs to.
That's one thing I sort of shared with Richard, is when I grew up in a 10-story kind of a slab block public housing building, and that I would be living on the 2nd floor, but my best friend would be living on the 10th floor. I would actually get down to the ground and I would scream and shout at him, hey, come down and let's play at the playground. And this is something that stuck in our head, that was the furthest visual and audio distance that you still to recognize the person, or actually recognize this person. And that's where, actually what happened was, this is actually a project that we did not realize before this. It was a competition we did almost 10 years before this, that we were only given an honorable mention. It was a competition for public housing. But because the ideas were so profoundly impactful on building communities, that we were asked by the ministry to try and realize some of these ideas. And for us, it was about building communities, and that was something that I think our original scheme had too many things going, and cost was a bit of an issue. So when we had to deal with this as a real project, we stretched the limit of how much public amenities we'll create, and that we decided that maybe 10 to 11 floors was the furthest that we would actually go.
Yes, and it was interesting, the discussion in the studio with Helen Lockhead was that whether 10 stories or 8 stories or 6 stories, but I think it's Cantonese. You have more projection to get
Yes.
10 floors.
It is true.
So the diagram of the block, so it's just basically cranked the traditional block to create this space inside, and then we dropped 2 floors to create the village floor under one half of the floor plate.
So the left image is from the corridor that comes off the lift. And this is where you can actually look down and see the common areas. We call it the village areas, the village green. And that was the crucial one where I said, you could actually recognize and hear someone who is down there. And that was the visual and audio distance that we would be able to extend, and what would be the maximum.
And the roof is actually, we called it penthouse for the people. So rather than the richest guy getting the penthouse, in this case, everyone could come up. And it's now become a very popular place to watch the sunset for the neighborhood, and like National Day fireworks. It tends to have a lot of picnics and things.
But it backfired on us too, because it appeared in Parliament as a nuisance complaint, that too many people were actually sort of coming up to this level, and that people living in this were saying that it's actually my terrace, but it's actually public housing in Singapore. Everyone owns it. So, and I think this is the NIMBY, sort of my backyard syndrome, that is causing some unhappiness.
But we had some good results from our post-occupation survey. reduction in energy bills, with the open cross ventilation and the vertical breezeways, we had 5% less use of air conditioning. Greater satisfaction with the thermal comfort. But I think the really key ones are the community ones that 1.3 times the number of neighbours considered friends. And for us, that was really the most critical one, because we just speculated with the design that we were designing for sociability, but it was really good to get confirmation in the data that it actually is a more sociable building.
No doubt this residential complex is quite big scale. It's like concrete jungle, but yeah, at the same time, it is quite small scale in the sense that the units are actually housed within certain villages. They're actually connected by all these intermediate sky gardens. It makes us want to not just stay within our homes, okay, but really to spend some time outside to just interact and bond with one another.
I think with all this being presented together, it increases the chance for interaction and also engaging the neighbor and the people around you. That's something that's lacking around in many parts of Singapore where you're just purely living in an urban jungle.
The idea of this building is trying to make it like a kampong style where you really try to meet up each other. When you're getting quite late in the night, it's actually very quiet. And the wind is good.
So we can have our dinners while enjoying the view over there. That makes it a perfect place for us to communicate and then to socialize among other neighbors.
Okay, Kampong Admiralty is a project we actually designed while we were developing those 5 measures, and so it was very self-consciously designed to score highly in them. It was a government project for a neighbourhood cluster of government services, medical, social housing, commercial and community. But we actually had 7 ministries we had to deal with that were involved in all these elements. And so the initial brief was to keep them all separate, so each one was less complicated, and they were just going to be convenient in that they were co-located, but there wasn't much interaction between them.
But the key component is really the social housing for elderlies, and that this is something that Singapore is actually quite concerned about and testing out quite a few experiments about how to handle elderly living in Singapore. And this was intended to be a integrated development where the elderly housing together with the medical center would make very good sort of a synergy where you don't treat the elderly, but you kind of keep them active and healthy. And I think that was the whole purpose of it. And I think when we understood this brief, we did certain things like we wanted the elderly here to be very active and to be able to sort of walk around in the building, to go to the urban farm on the highest level, and also at the same time to be connected by the metro back to the city itself.
So instead of the separate buildings, our idea here was to make a kind of club sandwich or layer cake whereby playing up on that horizontal connection, creating a lot of social spaces horizontally, and reorganizing the elements, we could release some essentially free benefits, if you remember the systems thinking idea. And so we basically reconfigured the medical center and the childcare and elder care and the retail in such a way to release major new spaces such as the public space under the building, and the public park on the top. And so in the end, we have a sort of really interesting situation where although the elderly housing is extremely convenient in that it's located over a lot of public services. It actually sits within a beautiful green park, and they have a community garden that they can get involved in right at their doorstep.
But at the same time, having a very vibrant public space on the ground level for the entire community. So this is a section, and this is where we stack the layers. As we mentioned, it was a club sandwich approach. We had the services in the subterranean. The ground floor is really a very public thoroughfare where it connects the neighborhood to the MRT. It also has some commercial component. The second floor is what we have called the food court in Singapore, the hawker center, which is actually subsidized food for most Singaporeans, and it sort of looks over the sort of a living room of the community. And the third and fourth floor is the largest footprint, where we use it as the shade and shelter for the public plaza, where it can actually operate all around the year, rain and shine, and also as a support system for the entire landscaping that goes on top of it. And then we have a very safe and secure environment for the elderly housing above.
And these are not just social spaces, but once again, we use them to perform environmental services. In this case, we have quite a complex water treatment and recycling system that runs through it. So in addition to being a public amenity, it's purifying and cycling the water around it.
But what is interesting about this section, if I were just to mention, is the very fact that we also conducted, well, not us, but the SUTD, which is another university in Singapore, conducted an analysis of this integrated development, whether it was actually successful or not. What they found using sort of very advanced sort of Bluetooth technology, where they could actually map the movement of the people within the building, a lot of the elderly people who live in the apartments here never actually touch the ground. They would move horizontally, or rather down to the 6th floor where the park is, enjoy the park and go up to the community farm, or they will go down to the 4th and 5th, 3rd and the 4th floor where the medical center is, or at the lowest, they go to the food center, the hawker center to get food. And for 1 week, they may not come down to the ground level. So this idea of a vertical city was sort of verified, and as a potential further development in Singapore, we were trying to do it high density, high amenity.
And I think it's something so ingrained in us that amenity happens on the ground. Your first reaction is that good or not? But I think in the end, what it does, it means we can actually choose how much amenity we want, almost without restriction. If you build it, they will come, kind of thing. So then the question is, how much do you want, rather than how much do we have left over, or how many more people can we squeeze into the existing amenity?
So this is the waiting reception area of the medical center, and we felt it was necessary to make it not feel like a medical facility. And in fact, you have daycare, you have day surgery here, and that actually the glass panel there is actually a one-way glass. The recovery is behind that. You look into this cocoon landscape area so that you could actually recover quicker. And this actually proved to be very successful within the medical center, and that we've been told they would like to adopt this layout and furniture in other medical center at our course.
Yeah, and the idea here, because in Singapore, the elderly are quite scared of hospitals. They feel like, they'll check in and they'll never check out. So and you saw, I think, the news in Hong Kong with COVID, that a lot of people resisted getting vaccinated and treatment just because they have a deep suspicion about doctors and hospitals. So the idea here was that it felt like a kind of mid-century living room that they would feel comfortable with and think of as a welcoming living space. And then the staff actually then just encouraged them to come here because it's air conditioned and relaxing,
yeah.
And then suggest they get their eyes tested or their
quite
blood
a few
pressure.
Years back, we do have the haze issue in Singapore, where our neighboring countries were sort of burning forests to create more oil palm plantations. Singapore was sort of clouded in a lot of pollution, and that we felt that for all the social housing developments, they're usually not air conditioned. We need to create sort of enclosed living spaces that can run through when that happens. And this was something that I think the development sort of embraced, and then we were able to realize some of these larger sort of aggregated sort of waiting areas and reception areas.
So some views of the park on the roof and the public mall. Oh, hang on, I'm not matching the one on my screen. Never mind, this is an
Yes.
aerial view. So I think it's an interesting rooftop elevation, I guess, in that, that idea of multiple ground planes and a green city full of amenity can be achieved on top of quite a big building.
This was actually taken quite sort of 1-2 months after the completion of building. If we were to take the picture again, it would be entirely covered with tree canopy. But one of the important things about that area view is that if it's entirely covered in tree canopy, the sun doesn't get to the building. So the building remains very cool. Again, another example of how we handle urban heatland effect within our buildings in the city.
Just, Simon, I think we're one slide out on the screen to the laptop. We did a post-occupancy survey of the biodiversity, and this was one of the first landscapes we'd actually worked with our landscape architects on to consciously design for biodiversity, and it was really very successful. We ended up with more species up on our roof than there were in the neighbourhood park, and so that to us was a great and clear example, that that's just choice of specification. Again, it's the same budget, same area of landscaping, but designed for higher productivity through the choice of species.
So the next one is the Singapore Pavilion at the Dubai Expo. So we do small projects. And this was us trying to compact all our ideas into a very small, precious little gem.
And we here tackled the last remaining surface where we had a planted ceiling, just to round it off.
But this sort of sums up our approach in a very small building, where we were trying to create a very immersive three-dimensional garden, the floor, the walls, and the ceiling all green, and then to create a new ground level that floats above this landscape, topped up by a solar canopy that makes it a zero energy pavilion and also zero water pavilion. So as you can see the layers, one thing that we have done was to limit the amount of buildings on the ground level. It only occupies 50% of the land. This is something that we are quite developing a new strategy again. If ever to do a new development, we will only want to occupy 50% of the land and to create as much area for actually landscaping and planting. We were able to demonstrate this in this pavilion, and then we had a floating gallery that actually connects all the structure, the thematic cones of this pavilion. And then as it goes up, it will have this sky market, and then above that, the solar canopy.
And it was an unusual pavilion in Dubai because it was totally not air-conditioned as far as the main spaces, and really used evaporative cooling together with radiant cooling from the plants to create a comfortable atmosphere.
But what we understood was that plants photosynthesize at a preferred temperature of between 10 to 30 degrees. That's the optimum temperature. And anything above 40 degrees, which usually is the case in Dubai, the plants stop photosynthesizing. So the design was really to create a sheltered environment for the landscape to thrive. We were able to bring the temperature down by 6 to 10 degrees so that the plants could photosynthesize, and when they photosynthesize, they were able to cool further through evapotranspiration, and that eventually it created a 6 to 10 degrees reduction in temperature in the pavilion, as opposed to being outside the pavilion.
And a really nice story was a family of doves moved in almost immediately and raised three sets of babies.
For the 6 months. So you can see we created a new dimension, the ceiling, as green as well, through having pots hanging down from the ceiling and being able to indirectly provide energy for the plants through grow lights without the heat. If we actually had the heat directly, the plants would not survive. But because it was giving the energy without the heat, the plants were able to thrive.
Oh, just back on that one. So you see in the top left is the evaporative cooling. These are not a new device, but we've been working with Transolar out of Munich and a Singapore contractor to sort of create a next generation one so they can guarantee all the water has evaporated within 1 meter of the fan. So it's totally dry, but still provides the cooling. There's some of the internal views.
Sky market as the new ground level. But this was the sort of data that we got out of it, and that we were able to actually have a green replacement of 170%. Almost 80,000 plants were actually used in this pavilion. The energy consumption is 100% provided for with the solar panel, and the water is actually, through the solar panel, desalination of groundwater. And that we were able to reduce by 6 to 10%. But what is really quite interesting is the sort of ecosystem services that this pavilion provided as compared to the sort of natural desert vegetation. You can see the red bar is the Singapore Pavilion overshoots compared to the natural habitat, as well as some of the detached single family homes in Dubai. What we actually set out to do was to study to see whether we can think of an alternative typology for the desert area, and that we feel we came quite close to a solution, and we are now actually actively trying to find ways to realize some of these ideas in the desert area.
If you imagine a whole neighborhood performing at this level, it would quite transform outdoor comfort in the neighborhood. Next one is a new hotel in Singapore, which is about to open in
Middle of the year.
Middle of the year, yes.
It's part of the remaking of Orchard Road, and that this was a redevelopment that started for us actually a very long time back. But it then became a real project for us in 2006. Because of COVID, it took a while. It will be finishing in 1 or 2 months' time. But this was really a reaction to the land scarcity in Singapore, where we are trying to find ways to actually create land and create real estate. And here we have actually replicated ground levels 3 times vertically. And because we wanted to make this a total Singapore experience, we actually had at the arrival a lowland rainforest feel to it, an experience. On the 5th floor, where the hotel guest room starts, we actually have a beach with coconut trees and palms in it, all full package. And then as it goes into the next terrace, we have the botanical gardens, where you could have weddings, and you could actually have a
ceremony.
Yes, ceremony, and that sort of mimics. But what's interesting is that it's covered, but you can actually have the functions throughout the year. And then at the very top terrace, we call it the Cloud Terrace, which is the highest level, where it's the experience you get when you're in sort of high-rise buildings. And the idea was actually to be able to do the ballroom at the top, something that was not the normal solution in the hotels in Orchard Road, and that we wanted people to be able to have sort of a cloud, a wedding in the clouds.
And it's almost finishing, but
this was 1-2 months back.
Yep.
And
the ceilings are all mirrors, so when you look up, you will see a beach, a forest, and a cloud.
Yep.
With people swimming around on the ceiling, so it should be quite fun.
But the very top, the same footprint of the building, is a solar canopy as well.
Another project which has been a long time coming is in Bangladesh, the Brak University. And this is a very interesting client, NGO who actually delivers a lot of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation work through India, Asia, and Africa. And so when they were building a campus for their university, they were on board to try and make it as high-performing as possible from a sustainability point of view.
This is somewhat based on the horizontal breezeway stacked typology that we created for the Singapore Art School that was built sort of almost 15 years ago. And when we got this opportunity of this mid-rise, high density, but we wanted a high amenity university, we adopted this model, and it was actually a better climate than in Singapore, where you have actually mild temperatures throughout the year. Through the wind funnels created by the horizontal breezeway, we could actually have most of the academic spaces as naturally ventilated, but only in the summer months, there is a hybrid system, which I think was also worked together, collaborated with Transolar to create, where it's actually a cool air, but with elevated wind speed in an enclosed environment. But most of the interaction and social spaces in between the academic spaces is a naturally ventilated breezeway. But as you can see, we have this stratum, maybe a bit back, is where we created a lot of intermediate sky gardens and park levels. And at the most important one is at the very top, we actually have a recreational field, a solar canopy, and the swimming pools for the university. So whatever that happened actually on most universities on ground level, we actually packed it up in a super dense development.
At the same time, although it's very dense, we were really keen for it to be a meeting place for the neighbourhood. And so the site was actually a toxic waste dump. So it was filled with sort of black water bubbling with hydrogen sulfide. And that was the only reason it was available, was that no one dared even put their foot in it. And so the idea is to turn that into public space, or a mix of public and university space. The university floats above, but it creates a kind of civic experience, which is really lacking in the area, which is really just big, crowded roads and developments built up to the boundary.
So this is the sort of the lower stratum, where it actually is a interface between the public and the university. The intent is for the ground level to be actually accessible by public. The BRAC has bought into the whole idea of providing public space for the community, and we felt it was actually very necessary for the BRAC organization to also handle some of the sort of the needs of the community, like healthcare. So there is a clinic within this development here that actually would reach out to the community. But what we really wanted to was to use a natural-based solution to help clean this toxic water and to be able to transform it into a very positive contribution to the community. So as you can see in the section, it's a very bold sort of two datums. One is the lower level, the stratum that I mentioned is the public interface with the university. And the upper level, you create, again, a very secure and safe environment for the university to happen. You can see the long section. The larger facilities are the lecture theaters, help funnels the wind into these horizontal breezeways that helps very effective cross-ventilation within the academic spaces. This was also verified by Transola in the School of Arts in Singapore, where the classrooms have got actually a higher oxygen level because of the effective cross-ventilation as compared to classrooms in schools that are actually on the ground level. So this is the upper level of the university, where it becomes a bright, airy, windy, breezy kind of environment. And this is where it was. We showed the earlier image of the superimposed on the building, and that's where we are today. Its structure is finished, fitting out is happening, and that it's the only building that we were able to create or realize this idea of the solar canopy over it. It is always so hard in Singapore because the buy-in by the state of providing sort of the full package or system layered together. But the very fact that you do not get very reliable energy in Dhaka, the university was very keen to actually provide them themselves so that their computers and their laptops would be running continuously. And so this was something that I think worked in our favor. So below the canopy and in the opening that you see in the solar canopy is a cricket pitch for the university. And then you also have a swimming pool that's actually hanging under that as well, and a 400-meter running track on top.
We're getting close to the end, I think.
Yes.
So.
We will do this very quickly. This is one of our sad story. Our very recent project where we wanted to drive ambition in public projects, but unfortunately, the state did not share our same ambition. We created a carbon negative headquarters for the sustainability ministry. Shocking, isn't it? But it's 100,000 of office space, and that we were, and we were able to actually make this a energy positive building. So the way we did it was, instead of building a tower on a podium, we actually optimized and maximized the surface area so that we could actually have solar harvesting facilities and on it. So on the vertical surfaces, we actually had a layer of vertical solar PV panels. Behind it is actually a layer of green that enhances the performance of the solar panels. Likewise, we did it on the roof, but yet at the same time, we're able to create a donut, a courtyard that allows a lot of light to come in, but create a very, like Singapore Pavilion, a very biocentric environment inside that also creates a new kind of work environment for the ministry. So the arrival is not a drop-off, but it's actually a public space, a park for the community. And yet we had this funnel, which is actually the lift core, but it's a big funnel that actually reflects light into this entire atrium space, but it also catches the wind from ground, and that we do have a device at the top. What did you call that?
The solar chimney?
The solar chimney, yes, that helps draw hot air out of the space as well. So that's the ground level plan, and that's a typical floor plan of the offices. Almost 40% of the office space, social space, workspaces are designed not to be air conditioned, but sort of naturally ventilated, but cooled by the landscaping.
Yeah, so that's a view of an office environment.
But I think it proved to be too daunting for the ministry, because they look at this image and say, who's going to maintain this?
But a little disappointing. We've done a series of competitions where we really hit the objectives, and they chicken out a little bit at the end.
Last year was a bad year for us. We took part in 2 competitions. We were so sure we had the best possible result of it, including a food master plan in Singapore that we demonstrated Singapore can actually get to food self-sufficiency. But again, we overshot the ambition. And then
another running track.
Running track on top, yes.
We're very fond of running tracks through buildings. And I think the last few slides.
This is the very last one.
This one is happening. This one is finishing.
Okay, but this also has a sad story. 10 years back, we took part in a sort of a new town development in Singapore for 250,000 residents, and we were able to demonstrate that we could be a zero energy new town. But when we got the feedback that, again, we overshot it, they were not so keen on doing a zero energy new town, but they were more interested in a livable environment for it. Not that we didn't create a livable environment, it was a very livable environment, but
Stop.
yes, like all architects, we are quite sore about the things that we did not achieve. But the good thing is that we persevered, and that we were able to realize in this development in Singapore, which is the PDD, is a combination of Singapore Institute of Technology and JTC's Business Park on the north east quarter of Singapore. Yeah. And this is a very forward-thinking, self-sufficient typology where we were able to look at the future of mobility and realize some of this idea that would be set in the decades to come.
Yeah, so it's a very complicated project in some ways, because it has new concepts of logistics and transport. So it's a totally car-free zone within the whole development. It has an enormous bus terminus inside it, as well as a MRT rail system coming in. The logistics is all driverless logistics, delivering it to the various components.
And also autonomous vehicle hub. In the future, cars will be mostly on-demand and autonomous. The facility here provides the parking for it. And it's also, like Richard mentioned, the logistic will all be robotic and autonomous. This is a space above the metro. Again, it's a large sheltered canopy for the public spaces. And above that is actually a sort of a digital, we call it a digital cannon, which is actually for startup companies, which JTC is sort of sponsoring by lowering the rents to gather them together. This is the forum for the university that is actually connected to the business park. And what is interesting is that we looped it around at the 5th level to have a collaboration loop. And also there is interchange of spaces between the university and the business park, so that's actually more collaboration. But what's really important for us, we were able to retain something like 4 hectares of natural greenery, and that we were able to cocoon the space and create it as a community park, from the day it's actually finished. And above that, the JTC, the business park, and the university is committed to testing out farming, and also farming under the solar canopy. So, and I think this is the...
And that's a bit of an example of where we enabled it. We knew they should be doing this. We put it in,
Yes.
They took it all out. Then so many years passed, the policy changed. They're going, where can we do this urban farming? And where can the PV go? And we were going, well, funny you should mention that, because we proposed it to you. And so it's been reactivated before the project finishes, which is really nice. And this was our concept for the overall master plan, is this, the solar canopy is one of the key drivers of the district. Our motto is no photon is wasted, that every photon from the sun should land on PV or plants or come in through a window and delight the human beings. There shouldn't be any turning into heat. So that's the end of our talk. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Mun Summ and Richard, for an incredibly inspiring and informative talk. We've got about 5 minutes for questions now. I believe we should have a roving mic, at the back. So if anyone has a question, if you could raise your hand, please. Otherwise, I'll have to ask a question. There's a question over here.
Of many of the things that you're able to experiment with, and then interestingly taking it to things like Dubai, etc., where you need to then remodify that environment to enable the plants to work, etc. But you must have found the environment of Singapore an incredibly useful gestation area, one way or another.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I think that everything grows so easily there. Also with the vertical sun path, we can put planting in quite narrow spaces because we don't have the summer and winter drift of the sun through the sky. So I think a lot of these strategies need to be modified very carefully for the latitude that you exist at. And I think just as a tropical rainforest is super dense and super connected, and a temperate forest might be lower and more spread out. We have to think about height and greenery and water usage in a very localized way.
Any other questions? There's a question just here.
Which I visited at an architectural science conference about 10 years ago. And I wondered if that was an inspiration or if you had comments on the similarities.
I think both countries have a similar housing board and system in the way it's a key platform of the government's contract with the people is deliver affordable housing. And there's also an aesthetic or expression part of it too, in that when we did it, we had to be very careful not to make it look too refined or expensive, because then it would be seen as the government spending too much money on this development rather than another one, because they're also very equitable in the way they want every public housing block to be perceived as the same quality. And so it was quite a deliberate play on our part to make it not look too different from other public housing to avoid that. Even when we did, the director of the public housing was grumbling when it finished, saying, now everyone's going to ask me why they all don't look like this. So it was seen as still maybe diverging too much from the norm.
So question just there.
Hi, just a quick question. I love your passion, but I'm sure you also have frustrations. I was just wondering if you could if you could share some of your top frustrations with your clients or otherwise.
I guess for us is most of our clients, including the government and the state, don't necessarily share our ambition, and that we sometimes tend to get over ambitious, like the idea of the self-sufficient city, being zero energy, and sometimes for the government, they were more interested in getting the housing solution quickly rolled out, rather than to have so many roadblocks that we created that they need to talk to other agencies. And that usually is the problem for us, is that we are told that they want a path that is of less resistance. They kind of want to build fast. They do not want to sort of work through the solutions with other departments. And this is for us the failing of society, where instead of being able to coexist and work out solution as one, we ended up with a lot of silos. And I think this is one of our biggest regrets in our practice.
Yeah, I think with the systems thinking, you have to connect things, but everyone's instinct is to chop them up into separate pieces because they're easier to administer. But I think Singapore is still a place, because it's a city and a country in one, and we only have one agency for each part of society versus local government, state government, federal government. It is easier there, probably more than anywhere else, to get the parts to start talking to each other. And our frustration does often turn out into, like 15, 20 years later, what we've been proposing does happen. So we do feel like we're planting little viruses all the time and always saying, why can't it be done? Often it doesn't benefit us with the project, might benefit someone else. But we have seen substantial change in 20, 30 years, I think.
That's also one of the reasons that drove us to put together this Garden City, Mega City book, which was really intended for decision makers and also for academia, for students to understand some of the ideas behind our work, and also to actually, we send this book to all the government agencies and to remind them, they need to have more ambition. This is something.
And play them off against each other. Yeah. So we can tell this URA in Singapore, oh, did you know Brisbane City Council's adopted some of these things? And they're like, what? They're our ideas.
in fact, we had a very good finished project in Taichung, where it actually have changed a lot of policies in Taiwan, where they adopted a lot of the ideas that we had in our development. They came to look for us because they wanted to transform Taichung as a city from a very industrial city to a more livable city.
They meeting the university in Taichung?
Yes.
Feng Shui University?
It was a very good situation where the academia, the industry and the real estate were working side by side, and they wanted to transform the city. And we had very good collaboration with the three parties, and we were very happy that they told us that they changed the rules and regulations to benefit the community.
Yeah, and now there's 80, from our project was a test project, and then now there's 80 projects adopting similar measures through Taichung.
More than Singapore.
Yeah, so it's one case where I think UNSW doing the studio with us is quite similar to what the university did in Taichung, and it really had an impact on the city at large, which was fantastic.
So if I can take the liberty then of asking the last question, and there'll be a chance to obviously to follow up with Richard and Mun Summ drinks following. You've been here 3 weeks now. You've been working with 28 of our students, and if you walk around at drinks and you see some students with bags under their eyes, it's because these guys have been working them hard. And they've been developing a high density, high amenity, net zero energy, food sustainable, food sufficient development, taking your philosophy and applying it to Sydney. So have you learnt anything through this kind of process? Can your philosophy, can Form Follow System be applied here? And how would it be?
Before you answer the question, we'd like to thank Belinda and Helen, who was part of this teaching with us, and it was a very enjoyable process.
Yes, in the second row there. Yeah, I think it's been really interesting because we've basically been, we set quite high targets for population, and we were really interested, can we propose these kind of densities and still have an area that felt like Sydney, you know, has Sydney's great lifestyle. It wasn't a Hong Kong walled city built in Sydney. And interestingly, the students, we targeted 6,000 to 8,000 people in the districts, and when we totaled up everyone's area, we ended up with 26,000 people in the area, and it felt very high amenity. I mean, it was a very rapid project, so it's not developed to a fine grain, but it really, I think, demonstrated you could have a very pleasant district. It was 50% open space. It had many community spaces of different scales. Fantastic.
Food sufficiency for 80%.
Yeah.
More than zero energy and sort of carbon negative emissions as well.
And we think in some ways like shooting for a sort of moon jump outcome can be a very useful thing to do rather than incrementally trying to just densify what's there. So this sort of just aims for super high density and says, could that be nice? We were prepared for it not to be, or for screams of horror. But it certainly looks like it could be an interesting area to develop further.
Fantastic. Well, without further ado, then it just falls to me to thank again Richard and Mun Summ. I hope you can join me in thanking them.